Keith is co-owner of Green Cover Seed and a man of faith. And I'm not going to read that whole thing, but we've got 25 years of no-till farming experience. You heard a little bit yesterday about the additional enterprises that have come on board. And let's just welcome Keith back to the stage, because the intro is less important than the content that you bring.
Houston, we have a problem. You know, when astronaut Jim Lovell said those words in 1970, he probably didn't think that would become, a standard cry for help even in the year 2025. But we all know what that problem was. Their oxygen tank blew up, and it started this iconic rescue mission from space. It's a great, great story. If you haven't watched that or read about that lately, it's really good to do. But they called back because they had a problem. And I'm here to say, agriculture, we have a problem here today. And we're not calling Houston, we need to call ourselves to try to solve this problem. We're really good at growing good crops, and we have high yields, but we have low profits because of all these high inputs. And we see that in these charts, and we see that in the economics, and we know we're facing these situations as we move forward. We've got supply chain issues. Sometimes it's hard to get things. We've got contamination and pollution issues all across the country. We have resistant weeds popping up all over the place. So maybe I should have said agriculture, we have problems, because there's more than just one. We also have this crazy and erratic weather, going from floods one year to droughts the next year. We just have all these issues with the weather and with hail and all of these things. But one problem overshadows all of these. And I think if we can get our arms around that, if we can fix this one problem, we'll solve many of the other ones. And that problem is simply the tremendous soil loss and degradation that we have experienced as a country, really as a world, over the centuries of farming, but it's been accelerated over the last 100 years since we've really gone to these industrial farming methods. So we see things like this, even today, 2023, we see tremendous amounts of water erosion. We all know what happened during the Dust Bowl. This is a picture from 1935, but it's still happening today. This is just a couple of years ago, heartbreaking scene in Illinois, where there was so much dust blowing across the interstate that they had this huge traffic pile up. And I don't remember if it was 10, 12 people died in this, but heartbreaking. Things that shouldn't be happening because we should know better. And even more than that, even more than the water erosion and the wind erosion, as a nation, we've lost more than half of the organic matter in the soils that we do have left. I showed this picture yesterday, but look at the difference in color. Look at the difference in color, and that is an indication of carbon. I want to just go back to these pictures and look at the color of the dust in 1935. That was black dirt blowing. Look at the color of the dust. Well, a lot of that smoke, but you've seen the dust storms now. They're not as dark because we've lost so much of the carbon. So, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve this problem of our soils being so degraded, of losing the carbon? What do we need to do? Well, we need to rebuild them. We need to rebuild them, and we can rebuild them. We've seen that on our own operations. We've seen that in others. So we need to rebuild our soils. We started out in our CS, during the Dust Bowl, it started out stopping erosion. And they've done a really good job of trying to prevent erosion since the 1930s. But we have to go beyond that. We need to do better than just stopping and preventing erosion. We need to rebuild what has been lost. And it's a huge task. There's 900 million acres of farmland in the U.S. About a third of that is crop ground, 2/3 of that is grasslands. But just because they're grasslands doesn't mean they're not degraded. We have some very degraded grasslands as well. So it's a huge, huge task that we're looking at if we're going to rebuild 900 million acres of cropped and pasture ground here in the U.S. So how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? And as I was thinking about this, this came to my mind. The book of Nehemiah in the Bible, to me, is one of the greatest rebuilding stories that I've ever read, because it was a huge task of rebuilding, and I think there's some really good leadership principles that we can pull from that book, from that story, from that example, and we can apply it to what we need to do today. Because we have a big task, they had a big task, and so let's see what we can learn from how they did their job, they did their project, and how can we apply that to ours today. So a little bit of background before we jump into looking at these leadership lessons. Here's the background of why the walls of Jerusalem had to be rebuilt. So the Jews had been in the Promised Land for 800 years, but for 490 of those years, they disobeyed the Sabbath rest for the land, because God had said every seventh year you need to let the land rest. You need to let it recover. And they ignored that edict, and you can read it there. I'm not going to read it all out to you. But for 490 years, they ignored that. And finally, God kind of got enough of that, and he said, okay, I'm going to punish you for this neglect of the land. And he says the whole land will be a desolation, and you will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. So you're going to get captured, you're going to get deported, and you're going to serve in Babylon for 70 years. And basically, it's 1 year for each of the Sabbath rests they skip. So 490 divided by 7 is 70, and so it was the 70-year punishment for not doing this. But here's what's interesting. We all, most of us know these verses from Jeremiah where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans for good, plans for your welfare and not for calamity." But we don't realize that comes right on the heel of him saying, you're going to have to suffer for 70 years because you ignored the land. And so that's the setting of what's going on here. So in 586, Babylon attacks Jerusalem. They burn down the city. They burn down the temple. They break down the walls, and they carry the people off into exile. So the Babylonians did that. And then later on, the Babylonians fall to Persia. So Persia defeats them. So it's essentially Babylon was Iraq, and Persia is Iran. So there's still all this conflict in the Middle East. And so these Jewish exiles get carried away over to Persia. They're part of the spoils of war. They get taken to Persia. In 536, Emperor Cyrus of Persia, he issues a decree, and he allows Zerubbabel and the first group of exiles to go back to Jerusalem, and they rebuild the temple in 516, exactly 70 years since they were defeated by Babylon. So this is the 70-year period. It doesn't mean everybody got restored, everybody got back, but the beginning happened in 70 years. And then 61 years after that, so they rebuilt the temple, or at least they started to. Ezra leads the second group to return, about 1,500 men and their families. So we're starting to get people back into Jerusalem after this exile. And then 10 years later, so it's 111 years after the fall of Jerusalem. It's about 30 years after Queen Esther was married to Xerxes. Many of you know that story. That's where Nehemiah starts. Okay, so that's kind of the background to setting this up, because they had rebuilt the temple, but the walls were not rebuilt. And that's a very important thing in cities back then, because that was your only means of protection. You didn't have armies per se, you had to have a wall to keep people out. So the book of Nehemiah starts out like this: the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. So before we go on, who was Nehemiah? Well, he was Jewish exile, so he was a Jew, but he was likely born in Babylon, in Iraq, and then he was taken to Persia as part of the spoils of war. So he's never even been in Jerusalem, but he's just heard the stories. He knows the heritage. He's been taught these things, and it says at the end of the first chapter that he was the cupbearer to the king. Now, that doesn't mean much to us today, but it's a pretty big deal. And I like the humility of Nehemiah, because he kind of tacks that on at the end. But basically what that means is, the king Just like today, there's all kinds of political turmoil, so people were always trying to kill the king so that they could take his place. One of the ways that they could do that is by poisoning his food or his drink. And so they would have official tasters to eat the food, and then if they didn't die, well, then it was okay for the king to eat. And they would have official cupbearers who brought the wine to the king, but they would try it first in front of the king, and if they didn't die, well, then it was okay to drink. So in other words, he had a very trusted position, but yeah, if you die, we can replace you. So it's kind of one of those deals. But he was still a slave, but he had one of the highest positions that a slave could have within this court of the king. So that's who he is, and here's how it starts. So the words of Nehemiah, and so he says, "It happened that while I was in the capital, some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning those Jews that had gone back and had survived the captivity. I asked them, what's going on in Jerusalem? And they said, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity, they're in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire." So in other words, all these people that had gone back, they're a mess because they got nothing to protect them. No one has rebuilt the walls. The gates are still burned. There's absolutely nothing to prevent people from coming in and taking anything that we have. And so I believe it was at that moment that Nehemiah understood the need to go and rebuild the walls. But I also think he understood the huge challenges that stood in his way. And think about it. He'd never even been to Jerusalem. He's only heard about it. But I think God put it into his heart that he was being called to undertake and to lead this huge rebuilding project. And so what he did is he put together the right leaders, the right workers, and the right tools. And that's what we need to do if we're going to rebuild 900 million acres of soil in the U.S. This is what we need to do as well. So I want to dig in and look at what characteristics of each of these we see demonstrated in Nehemiah, and then apply it to the work that we need to do here as well. So first of all, characteristics of the right leaders. Number one, they care deeply. If you have a leader that doesn't care deeply, it's not a good leader. He or she is not the right leader for your group or your organization. And we know that he cared deeply because he specifically asked the Jews that had come through how things are going. You know what? I sometimes purposely don't ask people how they're doing because I don't have the time to deal with what I might find out. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of that because we've gotten ourselves so busy that we don't have time to care deeply. But good leaders care deeply. And then in verse 4 it says, "When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days." Do we care that deeply about what we've been called to do? Do we care that deeply about our families, our organizations, our farms, our neighbors, our communities? We should. Now, I'm not saying you have to go and mourn and weep for days, but we need to care deeply if we're going to be a leader in this movement. And by the way, everybody in this room is a leader, okay? So don't be just spacing me off here because you're thinking, well, I'm not leading anything. You are. You're number one, you're leading yourself, you're leading your family, you're leading your own operation, and then some of you in here are leading at other levels, but every single person in here is a leader, so this applies to you. Number two, they prepare thoroughly. They prepare thoroughly. So Nehemiah was inspired to rebuild the walls immediately, but he didn't do anything for 4 months. And the book of Nehemiah is very exact about these dates. If you read it, he gives exact months and dates, and so it's very easy to track the timeline throughout Nehemiah. He's very good about listing all those dates. And so it was 4 months before he took any action, even though he was inspired right away. And he was praying, and he was fasting. He was preparing before he took any action. And I think that's important too. You know, if you have a leader that cares, but then just jumps off the handle and does the first thing that comes to their mind, well, that may not necessarily be the right thing. So you need to have that time of preparation. Number three, then they act boldly. They act boldly after they prepared thoroughly. Look at what he did here. So it came about that the wine was before King Artaxerxes. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick?" Isn't that great that the king knew him well enough that he could tell that he was sad but not sick? And Nehemiah said, "This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" And this is where we need to be ready, because at some point, someone is going to ask you, what do you want to do about the problem? What do you want to do about it? Yeah, I see that that's a problem. What are you going to do about it? And so we need to be prepared to act boldly. Here's what he said. So Nehemiah said, "I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. This tells me he had thought about it, he had prepared, and he knew what he thought it would take. And so he was able to give an answer when called upon. He acted boldly when his chance came, and he took it. And are we ready to do that? Are you going to be ready if somebody comes and says, we've got a lot of soil erosion in this county. What are we going to do about it? We've got a position on our conservation district board. Would you be willing to serve? Those are the things, those are the opportunities where we have to be ready to act boldly when somebody says, "What would you request?" And then number 4, they humbly lead by example. Good leaders are humble and they lead by example. We read later when they're working on the wall, Nehemiah says, "I also devoted myself to working on the wall, and I refused to acquire any land." So he could have taken a lot of land. He could have taken advantage of the situation and really gathered riches for himself. I'm sure we have no politicians that do that these days, right? But he was humbly leading by example because he was working on the wall and not taking advantage of his position just to boss everybody else around and then take the riches. That's a good leader. That's a good leader. And then number 5, they share vision and they inspire courage. They share the vision and they inspire courage. And we're going to see that as we look at what are the characteristics of a good worker, because good workers come because good leaders develop them, and they share that vision and they inspire that courage. So be this kind of leader. Care deeply, prepare thoroughly, be ready to act boldly, humbly lead by example, and then share vision and inspire courage in those around you, and you'll be a great leader at whatever level you're called to be at. And you will move up if that's your desire and God's plan for you to leading more and more people. So we need leaders like that in our soil movement. If we're going to rebuild 900 million acres of soil, we need leaders like that. And fortunately, we do have a lot of leaders like this, but we need more. And then it does no good to have leaders if you don't have workers, because the leaders, they need to do some of the work, but they can't do all the work. So what about the right workers? So they share a common vision. The right workers, they all share a vision for what the project is, and that vision has to be set and communicated and championed by the leader, but the workers have to buy in. So here's what he says in chapter 2. "So we went up at night and we inspected the wall. The officials did not know that I had gone, nor I had told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. Then I said, 'You see the bad situation that we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates are burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach.' And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me and the king's words. And then they all said, 'Let us arise and build.' So they put their hands to the good work." You see how a leader develops that vision? He inspires them to this common vision. And these people who didn't necessarily have a lot of buy-in before, they said, "Yes, we're with you. Let's get going." And wouldn't it be great when we all leave this conference that we just say, let us arise and start rebuilding our soils? That's what they said. That's what we need to be saying too. Number two, they're willing to learn. The priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who did the work. I love how he says this, because these are like all the bureaucrats right here. The priests, the nobles, the officials, and then all the people who actually worked. Things don't change very often, do they? But these are not skilled carpenters. These are not skilled stone workers. He did not have trained workers to do this project. He had a bunch of bureaucrats that didn't know how to work, and then he had a bunch of workers who didn't know how to build the wall. But dedication to the cause is more important than a pre-existing skill set if the person is willing to learn. So when we interview people for working at Green Cover, we don't necessarily look to see if they've got tons of experience that would apply to selling cover crops or promoting soil health. We ask more, what is their character like, and are you willing to learn? And if the answer is yes, then come on in. We got a spot for you. Number three, they do not get overwhelmed. And it's easy to get overwhelmed. Here's what they had to do. This is an artist rendering of what the Jerusalem in that day would have looked like. So the wall would have been nearly a mile in circumference, an average height of 15 feet, 12 feet wide at the bottom, 7 feet wide at the top, 10 gates and 6 towers. He had unskilled workers and a hostile work environment. So it would have been easy to get overwhelmed, because that's a pretty major task that they're working with. That's a lot of rocks to move. That's a lot of stones to put in place. That's a lot of gates to build. That's a lot of towers to rebuild. It's easy to get overwhelmed. Just as it is easy for us to get overwhelmed when we think about the 900 million acres that have been degraded. How are we going to get started on that? We keep being told that there's going to be 10 billion people we have to feed. Lots of pressure. And do we have a hostile work environment? Some more than others. And we'll see examples here that may be familiar to you. So, how do you not get overwhelmed? This is genius. This is what Nehemiah did. This is exactly what we need to do. He says, above the horse gate, the priests carried out repairs, each in front of his house. After them, Zadok, the son of Immer, carried out repairs in front of his house. After him, Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, carried out repairs in front of his own quarters. You see, you focus on the portion of the work that God has given you to say grace over. He had them all start by rebuilding the part of the wall right in front of their own house, because that's what was most important to them. That's what brought them the most benefit. And then they could reach out and help their neighbors. And so if we want to rebuild our soils, we need to start with our own. We need to rebuild our own soils. We need to restore our own ranch lands. And then we can start branching out and helping our neighbors in our community. That's exactly what he did here. And then it's not so overwhelming. You don't have 900 million acres to rebuild. You have your own place to rebuild. And then reach out. Help your neighbor. Each one to his own work is how he said it here. And then number four, these workers are courageous. You are going to have to work because not everyone is going to support you. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. Not everybody's going to support what we're doing here. And some may even ridicule you. He said to the brothers and wealthy men, what are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones? Even if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. So they were getting made fun of. Some of you have gotten made fun of for some of the things that you've done on your own farm and your own operation. You can relate to this, but it doesn't stop you from doing the work. You keep working on, even if you're the subject of plotting and attacks. Now, hopefully none of us are going to get attacked for the work that we're doing. Hopefully it stops at the ridicule level. But the Jews did. Nehemiah's people did. All of them conspired together to come against and fight against Jerusalem and cause a disturbance in it. The people around did not want this to happen because they were able to come in and take whatever they wanted when there was no wall. So they didn't want to see this happen, and so they wanted to disrupt this. So how do we get these courageous workers? Well, good leadership sets the example. Okay, it goes back to the leaders. Nehemiah says, but we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. Number 2, you be prepared and you continue the work in spite of the threats. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. So they had a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other hand. So if you're under threats, if you're under pressure, if you're being ridiculed, yeah, you deal with it however you need to, but you keep working. You keep working. That's what they did. That's what we have to do as well. And as we're rebuilding our soils, these are the right workers that we need. So when we have the right leaders and the right workers, and then we combine that with the right tools, we can do amazing things. Every job is best accomplished with the right tools. Now, I don't know. This is just guessing what tools they had. It doesn't really matter. That's not the important part of it. But they used the best tools that they would have had at the time to accomplish the project. And I'm just going to go through these real quick because I don't have a lot of time, but you all know these. This whole conference has been about what tools do we have at our disposal in order to do this project of rebuilding our soils. The soil health principles, those are the tools. Keep the soil covered, so very important. Minimize the disturbance, whether it be physical or chemical. Minimize those disturbances and have things that look like this. Number 3, maximize the diversity. You've all heard this preached. We want as much diversity out there as possible. And if you're doing a cover crop, get as much diversity in there as possible. Look at the difference in root diversity here versus over here. So we want to maximize that diversity as a tool. Number 4, have living roots as often as possible. And now that's easier in a perennial setting, but if we overgraze it, now those roots aren't living as much, okay? We just learned that up here. So keep those roots living, growing as healthy as possible, and then integrate that livestock whenever and however you can. Those are the tools, and again, if I'd had more time, we could talk about that more. But you've been hearing that in all of these sessions. These are the tools that we have at our disposal to do these big projects. So when you put the right leaders, the right workers, and the right tools together, you can do some pretty amazing things. So how long did it take Nehemiah to do this? How long did it take him and this team of unskilled workers to rebuild this wall that's nearly a mile in circumference, 15 feet high, 12 feet wide, all these gates, all these towers? How long do you think it took him? Do we have any Bible scholars in here? He tells us, and again, he is very precise on his dates. And so he says, so the wall was completed on the 25th of the month of Elul in 52 days. Obviously not a government project. 52 days to get this project done. That's incredible. That's incredible. But it's because they had the right leaders and the right workers, and they used the right tools. And so how long will it take us to rebuild our soils? Well, I wish I could tell you that it would be just 52 days. It's not going to be, but it's also not nearly as long as what the experts tell us. You know, if you took soils class, they probably say, well, it takes 1,000 years to develop 1 inch of soil. And that's true if all we're relying on is the weathering of rock. But folks, we've got way more options and resources and tools than just the weathering of rock. When we're applying these principles of soil health, we can rebuild these soils much, much faster. And many of you have seen it on your own farms and your own operations. You've seen how we can build that soil, how we can bring that organic matter back to the soil much, much quicker than the experts tell us. So, what about that Sabbath rest for the land? Because I want to come back to that. I don't want to just leave that hanging out there. Remember, they got punished because they didn't observe that. And I don't believe we're still under those same laws or edicts, and so I don't think we're in danger of being punished. But God didn't just say, let that land rest because he wanted to rob them of a year of production. He was doing it because the land needed that to remain productive for the other 6 years. And so there's something to that principle that I don't think we should just ignore and just say, well, no, we're not going to do that. But is one rest year or fallow year, and I want to talk about that word here in just a second, 1 year out of 7, is that practical for us? Is it affordable for us? Well, probably not for most of us. And when it says fallow, and sometimes it's translated fallow often in the Bible, and we think about fallow being nothing growing, that's not what this means. And if anybody says, well, you should not let anything grow on your land for a year, that's what the Bible says. First of all, tell them that's not what the Bible says. It says you just let whatever wants to grow, and you don't harvest. That's how the land rests, is plants are growing and we're not taking. That's what it means by rest. But is that affordable? Is that practical? Probably not, unless you can run cattle on there and you can graze it. And I know a lot of people are doing that type of a thing with a regenerative year. But here's what I want to put out in front of you to think about. What if instead of doing 1 year out of 7, what if we did 1/7 of the year? Because if you take 365 days divided by 7, you know what you get? 52 days. Now, I'm not saying that's how long it took them to rebuild the walls. I think it's kind of cool. But here's what I do think is really interesting. When people tell us, what's the optimum time that we need to grow a cover crop to get all the benefits or most of the benefits? You know what I usually tell them? About 7 weeks. 52 days. You can get 52 days out of a cover crop, you'll get the majority of the benefits that you're going to get. And so I'm here to say that I think that we can accomplish the same thing that God was wanting them to do, to restore, to maintain the soil health and the integrity of the soil by letting it rest 1 out of every 7 years. I think we can do that same thing by giving it growth with no harvest, no export for 1/7 of the year. And so if you can get a cover crop growing for 52 days or, 60 days, it doesn't really matter the time, but get it in there, because that's what's going to allow your land to rest, to recover, and to rebuild. And I think that is going to honor that principle of resting and regeneration for the soil. So be a leader. You're each leaders. You're also going to be workers. Remember these different things, and let's all go out and put our hands to the good work. Thank you.